One thing that's problematic about this, besides the basic boredom of this very academic form of communication, is that I'm afraid if you're not deeply into Freud's ideas about arts, you're going to be disappointed. Because people who feel attracted to the arts world usually find that there is something very valuable there, something even maybe mysterious there. And Freud approached this topic as he approached more or less any other topic. He would conquer it. He would tell you whatever there is. There is no mystery that Freud was not able to solve. And then everything that's about arts can be reduced to some of the basic psychoanalytic principles. So in a way, many people, many artists and many people who enjoy arts, who are passionate about arts, have already been disappointed by Freudian approach and looked for other approaches inside psychology or outside. So try to get ready for that, not to be too disappointed. I'll try to review the basic facts, the basic ideas and emotional problems Freud had with arts, and then we can discuss them in various ways. So this is the plan. Some basic notions today. The next week about what Freud liked most. So that's his collection of antiquities. I'll save some time for that. Then his daily visits to Michelangelo sculpture, the one very special Michelangelo sculpture in Rome. And then, of course, Freud's Shakespeare, who is everywhere in Freud's work. And then over the last 2 weeks, if you bear with me until then, we will discuss in details 2 very specific situations. Freud met 2 geniuses of 20th century art, spent some time with them, they came to him, and then basically nothing very important happened, unfortunately. Freud met Gustav Mahler not in Vienna, where both of them lived for 10 years, walking distance one home from the other, but in Holland. Mahler traveled for 24 hours to spend 4 hours with Freud and then 24 hours back. In the city named Leiden. So some people say it was his Via Dolorosa. He suffered on the way to come to the suffering city. So we'll talk about that, and I'll tell you in advance, I'll play some music that evening, because that was the summer of 1910. Mahler was finishing the orchestration of the 9th Symphony and he was composing the 10th Symphony. So we will try to figure out how the meeting with Freud and the music Mahler was composing may be related to one another. And finally, we'll end up with the person who some believe is the most important poet of the German language, at least in the 20th century, and whose childhood and growing up were extremely traumatic. Rilke met one very important woman who was friend of Freud's and collaborator of Freud's for a certain time, and so in 1913, Freud and Rilke met in the lobby of one hotel in Munich, surrounded by many people, extremely introverted and anxious. Rilke couldn't get what he was looking for. And then he paid Freud a visit once after that in Vienna. Again, I'll try to show you the connection between these 2 events and Rilke's only novel, published in 1910, which is a very unusual form of a novel. Most people believe that Joyce's Ulysses is the first contemporary novel. I'd like to try to show you in 3 weeks why I think Rilke's novel, which is 13 years earlier, is in fact the first contemporary novel. And then I'll try to trace psychoanalytic motives in Rilke's poetry that came subsequently, in the early 1920s, especially Duino Elegies number 3 and 4. The title, as you see it here, The Role of Arts in Freud's Psychoanalysis, might be unusual or controversial in more than one way. First of all, Freud himself would never say, arts influenced my work. He would not say that openly. He would not admit it very openly. On the other hand, psychoanalysis in Freud's time and later on was applied to the arts. So we as psychoanalysts most often believe we know something that's very special, and then we offer our wisdom to other people, and then we explain what happens to them. Only in the 1970s, and then not very strongly, did psychoanalysts start thinking there might be something we can learn from the world of arts. And that's not frequent or strong. So I'll try to look at this. How did the arts influence Freud? This is just a brief timeline. I apologize if you all know this already. I just wanted to provide a brief timeline. This is the house where Freud was born, nowadays Czech Republic. This happened in 1956. So last year it was 160 years since Freud was born. When he was 3 years old, his family moved to Vienna. So he spent 85 years living in Vienna. The last 18 months in London, the first 3 years in the Czech Republic, in the small town of Freiburg or Pribor. He decided to be a medical student. He was excellent in that. He was a researcher in a neurophysiological lab. And he became a neurologist in private practice in Vienna because he had to support his family. After 85 years in the capital of a kingdom and a cultural metropolis and so on, he moved to London. I will show you more next Monday than today what he brought with him to London. He died on September 23rd, 1939. It is more accurate to say that he committed, in a way, assisted suicide. His medical doctor, Max Schur, was instructed to give him a double dosage of morphine when Freud would not be able to cope with pain anymore. So that day was September 23rd. So Freud died in haze, in overdose, like many junkies do nowadays, unfortunately. Throughout his life, Freud was strongly ambivalent toward arts and even more so toward artists. I hope you can see this drawing. This is from a paper Freud published in 1879. So at the moment when he was 22 years old. These are nerve cells of some sort of fish that I cannot tell you which one it is. So Freud wanted to be a natural scientist. And for the decades after this, Freud wanted to explain psychological phenomena in neurological terms. He hoped a day would come when people would have enough methodology and technology to describe everything in neurological terms. Because he was not able to work at the university and he worked in private practice, he, alas, had to be a psychologist, to use psychological terminology. He never liked that. This is how Freud described himself to his best friend at the time when he was developing psychoanalysis, Wilhelm Fliess, who was a medical doctor from Berlin. Freud thought of himself as a conquistador. Freud believed that his temper was a temper of a person who is doing a conquest, of a soldier, of someone who will battle and won what he considered important. A conquistador, an adventurer with all the temperament and blah, blah, blah. So Freud would never describe himself as sensitive, poetic, melancholic, introverted, and so on, as we most frequently describe young adolescent artists. This was the year 1900. So we've used one of these illustrations for the web page that you've probably seen. This is Oskar Niemann, a sculptor from nowadays Croatia, who very young moved to London. And Paul Federn, one very important German psychoanalyst of the time, persuaded Freud to pose for Niemann in 1931. But I think the posture Freud has here shows very clearly his suspicion. He does not really trust this. It seems to me he does not really, he's distant from this. He is not really into the story. This suspicion comes from various sources. So these are two quotes from Freud. There is a general enmity between artists and those engaged in the details of scientific work. So in his publications, Freud describes that artists are his enemies, that there is a rivalry between the world of arts and the world of sciences. Artists possess in their art a master key to open with ease all female hearts, whereas we stand helpless at the strange designs of the lock and have first to torment ourselves to discover a suitable key to it. So it comes from the angle that maybe you did not expect. It is about female hearts. So when Freud later on tries to say, what is the motivation for someone to become an artist, he sees it in several domains. So that artists will be very popular and all women would like them, so that they will get rich, or that they will become powerful and influential. Nothing of the beautiful soul that wears the gloves and talks to other spheres, nothing about muses, nothing about outside world's metaphysics or anything. Sexuality, money, and power. Where does this come from? When Freud was a boy, you can see this is a painted portrait. He was so beloved by his mother that he had to be painted as a child. You can see, I hope, a book in his hand. From the very early age, Freud had a separate room in a very big household so that he can think and read and write undisturbed. These are the languages he spoke. He was very fluent in Latin and Greek until the last days. When he was already in London, so at least 82 years old, some of his children and grandchildren were talking about what was the beginning of Homer's Iliad. And Freud started reciting it in Greek, and he could do that for several minutes. Late in his life, when he was about 75 years old, Freud learned Spanish, just to be able to read Cervantes. So imagine learning something new at that advanced age, and just for the enjoyment in a single novel. The legend has it that Freud read Shakespeare in the original English at the age of 8. If you ever tried that, I mean, I'm not sure how many kids we will ever meet who know the word Shakespeare by the age of 8. But to learn in a foreign language and to learn so complicated verse in complicated syntax, that must have been admirable. Freud's heroes were many and different. We will talk about some of them, the archaeologists, next week. But one group of his heroes were German Romantic poets. And wherever you go through Freud, you will see quotations from them. One brief but important paper that Freud published in the year 1915 was in the book Goethe's Land. So the book in 1915 that was published with a single purpose to embolden the German nation by reminding the people of their great poet had the contribution by Freud as well. Throughout his career, Freud was considered to be one of the best stylists of German language. It happened to me a couple of times since I've started teaching in Berlin that students tell me with an expression of pain on their faces, I've tried to read Freud, but it's so complicated I gave it up after several pages. Would you agree with that? Is he too complicated in German? No? This is Freud's study in London. And we will talk about it in detail next week. This is the famous couch. You may remember, by the way, Freud recommended us to be very impersonal. And all that you can see on the desk and everywhere here, this is Freud's collection of antiquities. He started very young. He had expert advisors from the Museum of Art History in Vienna, and he collected about 2,000 pieces. All that you see here in these photographs are originals. Some of them are 4,000 years old. Etruscan, Roman, Greek, Egyptian art. This is what Freud's room looks from other angles. This is the desk in Vienna. This is the room in London. You can see them both today. 90% of everything is in London. So how is it possible to be at the same time natural scientist, very suspicious of artists, and be completely surrounded by works of art all the time? I somehow imagine being analyzed in this room, I would be distracted by everything that was around me. This is Lou Salome. You may have heard the name. Very important person, as one-time companion of Nietzsche, then the lover of Rilke, and then a collaborator or a pupil of Freud's. She was considered to be extremely bright and to be able to understand people with ease, and usually very correctly. So this is her letter to Freud in 1916. Although you definitely disclaim the possession of an artistic temperament, it nevertheless seems doubtful whether an achievement such as yours would have at all been possible if that factor had been so entirely lacking. It seems to me, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that she doesn't really dare tell him that he's wrong, but that she does think that he's wrong. And that his belief that he has no artistic temperament is wrong. So, we come to Freud as author, and there are books, there are people who write about Freud and his literary style. Who would be Freud as an artist? First, we have a series of Freud's case studies. You may have read at least one of them. Dora, or Little Hans, or two male patients, one called the Rat Man, another called the Wolf Man, and so on. Many people criticized Freud that he was trying to found a science on the basis of short stories. And they believed his case presentations were not a scientific stuff, but completely literary stuff. Freud was deeply insulted by this. And one of the reasons he wanted this neurological side of his interest to become stronger is exactly this. He didn't want to be compared to the novelists or the artists. More importantly, what is it that Freud does when he works with patients? What is it that nowadays psychoanalysts or all sorts of orientations do when they try to treat patients? There are these moments when you're trying to formulate a correct and timely interpretation. And interpretations almost never come simply from the rational part of your personality, so that you know something or you've read in a textbook or there is a manual that told you after this do that, but they come from some sort of inspiration. There is an insight or a connection in your mind or a fantasy even that you use in order to provide interpretation for your patient. So even nowadays, for instance, when we discuss the education of psychoanalysts, there is a belief that this education resembles 4 different kinds of schools. And one of these schools is the art school. So like in art schools, psychoanalysts have their supervisors. And they bring their work, and this work is commented and improved, and then they bring the next version again, and so on and so on. And the supervision teaches you, in a way, how to use your unconscious, how to use, we use very complicated words like countertransference and so on. How to use your fantasy, how to use the irrational reactions inside your mind in order to be able to help your patient. So in a way, Psychoanalysis cannot give up the artistic side of it. And some believe even psychology, the usual psychology, cannot. Yet, Freud, again, would never like to admit this. He would never like you to think that what he does and what he teaches other people to do is a form of art. Now, when it comes to outside recognition, Freud did receive in the year 1930 the award, the prize, from the city of Frankfurt. That still nowadays is being awarded to people whose contribution can be, in a way, paralleled with the contribution of the greatest author in the history of German language. When Freud was given this award, it was not for his scientific achievement. It was for his written work, for his complete papers, for his style, and for his contribution to the culture. This final point, I cannot prove to you that it is absolutely historically true. So there is a rumor, you can find it in different books, but I don't think anyone has ever had a document as an evidence for this. But allegedly during the 1920s, the Nobel Prize Committee in Sweden considered Freud as one candidate for the prize. They just didn't think he should be the winner for medicine or physiology. They thought he should be the winner for literature. Do you know about another case of that kind, more or less these same years? Certain Albert Einstein. They believed Einstein should not win the Nobel Prize for physics, but for literature as well. They thought it was more philosophy than science. It took us almost 1 century to prove them completely wrong. Many people believe that Sigmund Freud should be remembered as a historical figure just because he was the grandfather of one of the most important, at least English, but maybe internationally most important painters of the late 20th century. So we usually believe Lucien Freud to be just the grandson of the guy who founded the science that many of us have devoted their professional lives to. Many people believe the opposite. So artistic temperament, sensitivity, inclination, something was present in the family, and then it gave fruit later on. Some of you may have been at the lecture maybe a year ago at the IPU when Lucien Freud's daughter was the guest of the university. No? So his daughter is now also in the arts, not as successful as he was, but the line of artists in the Freud family still lives. What I basically meant to show you of these initial several minutes, there seems to have been a very strong ambivalence in Freud when it comes to being completely surrounded by arts, by sculptures and paintings and books, and then completely dismissing the value and importance of these enemies who can win female hearts much easier than he can. Now, here's something about the attitude. We know for sure from the reminiscences of his friends and the correspondence with one of them, Eduard Zilberstein, that Freud wrote lyric poetry. When he was 15 or 16 years old, he even fell in love with the mother of one girl who was his and Zilberstein's age. That is the only sign we have from Freud's biography of any kind that he had fallen in love, that strong emotions overwhelmed him. He is, I think, 16, 1872 or something like that. By the way, years later, Freud burned all of his papers and correspondences, expecting that one day historians will study his biography and wanting them not to be able to discover these details. Also, the correspondence with Fliss. he burnt all the papers, all the letters Liszt sent to him, and then Princess Bonaparte managed to buy Freud's letter from one dealer. So that's how we know a little bit about his youth. So Freud then felt anything connected to artistic temperament to be completely wrong, and he wanted to get rid of that. So he, in a way, most probably trained himself, disciplined himself into being a natural scientist, a psychoanalyst, and so on and so on. There were many aspects of his personality and many aspects of life that he never really got in contact with. This is a little gossip that might be related to this and might not. It is present in many of the most important Freud biographies, in Gay, in Breger, and several other books. While Freud was engaged with Martha, they still were not married. Their engagement was very long, I think 8 years. There were two artists who were interested in her, and Freud was jealous. And some believe this was the additional reason why later, as a psychoanalyst, he would be so against them. In 1927, Freud, in one letter to the famous French novelist Romain Rolland, wrote about something he called the oceanic feeling. The oceanic feeling is Freud's term for the state or experience or emotion when you're connected to the universe, when the boundary between yourself and the rest of the world in a way dissolves, at least briefly. So for the moments of ecstasy, inspiration, being drunk, orgasm, religious ritual, whatever. Freud wrote to Rolland that this experience was completely strange to him. That anything that was similar to the oceanic feeling, mysticism, music, or falling in love, was completely alien to him. And now, from all that we know about him, this seems to be completely correct. This is a quotation from the paper on Michelangelo's Moses that we'll discuss in more detail next week. This is not about the basic topic. The basic topic is Moses and how Michelangelo represented him and so on. And this is like a side note. Trying to apprehend them in my own way, that is, to explain to myself what their effect is due to. Wherever I cannot do this, as for instance with music, I'm almost incapable of obtaining any pleasure. Some rationalistic or perhaps analytic turn of mind in me rebels against being moved by a thing without knowing why I'm thus affected and what it is that affects me. There most probably was a moment during his adolescence, or a disposition toward that even before, that Freud becomes an absolutely rational being who will not allow himself any other sorts of influences. So he cannot enjoy whatever he cannot understand. And so, just as I told you, we have no clear sign that Freud ever fell in love. It is more or less almost certain that Freud never had sexual relationships before he got married, and he was, I think, 30 or 31 when he got married. He got 6 children over the next 9 years, and most probably after the 6th pregnancy, he never had sexual relationships with his wife again. When Freud was a boy, his sisters learned to play the piano. And that was Vienna, 1880s. Strauss's, waltzes, Wagner's, whatever. Freud hated music so intensely that he required of his mother that the piano has to be kicked out of the apartment. And she adored him so much that she would do whatever he wished, so his sisters were forbidden to play the piano. It happened several times. His friends tell us in their reminiscences that Freud would enter a restaurant where there would be live music. He would cover his ears, make a painful expression on his face, turn around and disappear from that restaurant. We'll talk about that when we come to Gustav Mahler. Freud most probably visited opera 5 times in his life. Now, that's not unusual for us today, but this is Vienna around the turn of the century. The court opera was the most important institution in the whole empire, and Freud never cared. There is one moment in Freud's life when he cried. That is when Gestapo when Gestapo arrested his daughter, and no one knew when Anna would be released. They set her free the next morning, but that night Freud cried, one time in his life. There is no sign that Freud ever tasted alcohol. There was just one thing that was his addiction, that he couldn't live without: cigars. When the World War I came, people were freezing, people were hungry, his ink was freezing and he could not write, but he was suffering without cigars. And he would say, I cannot even think without my cigars. So Freud had this very important limitation: exclusively rationalistic attitude toward everything, and then arts included. He could not enjoy music or theater or opera, but we don't know how in fact he enjoyed his poets, how in fact he enjoyed his sculptures. Was it really an emotional inspiration, or was it the analytic attitude toward understanding these worlds? Yes?
There was a lecture at the IPU last year, and someone wrote a biography of Freud, or some review.
André Peteralt.
Okay, maybe. And he connected this problem of Freud with maybe the infant years of Freud and the relationship with his mother in the age where there were no words and non-verbal thing. What do you think about that?
There are several papers about Freud in the arts, and that is one of the ideas. Freud grew up in the Czech Republic in a Jewish family, but his nanny was Czech and Catholic. So as a very small boy, Freud was taken to Catholic Mass. The sounds he may have remembered from the childhood were the bells and the singing and the organ of the Catholic Church. So there are psychoanalysts who believe, one, that Freud is a Jew, inside of him a Catholic infant is hidden. Two, that Freud started hating music when his family moved to Vienna and he had to separate from his nanny. So he decided unconsciously to forget about her and the experiences related to her, so then about religion and about music as well. Yes, I didn't mention that a couple of minutes ago. Freud was a staunch atheist. He called himself a godless Jew. So again, this form of ecstatic experience some people have in religious ceremonies was completely alien to him. He wrote papers and books against religion. And then the third idea, so Catholic inside, separation from the nanny, and the third idea was there is something in his very early world, in his, we would nowadays call it pre-Oedipal, pre-verbal word, the first 18 months, that did not go well, so he wanted to forget about that and focus just on the verbal, cognitive, symbolic, intellectual. Unfortunately, as with all sorts of hypotheses about historical data, there's no way for us nowadays to prove or disprove. But it seems to me there was, anyway, whatever it is, something very strong and very deep inside of him. Maybe subjective. I would not be able to imagine the world without music, so I cannot imagine what his life might have looked like. Yes?
I wonder with the oceanic feeling, it's something that you have to experience to be able to say something, or you know that it exists because you cannot really fully describe it in words. So I wonder how he got the idea to use that term at all and to think about something like that if you have never experienced it.
Yeah. So there are two things that come before this. The first one is Freud's idea of primary narcissism. 1914, Freud expresses this idea that life starts in this phase, several weeks, several months, when you don't distinguish between yourself and physical or social objects. The whole world is you. The whole world is there for you to enjoy, and you just take what you need for enjoyment. So, psychoanalysts then at that time believed that this experience was present just in the unconscious. We all have experienced it, just we are not aware of it. Another point, I mentioned the correspondence with this French novelist took place in 1927. Not long before that, Freud's at that time closest collaborator, a Hungarian psychoanalyst, Sándor Ferenczi, published a very strange book, the title of which is Thalassa. Thalassa is the Greek word for the sea, and this is the book in which Ferenczi, among other things, wrote about the importance of regression. How sometimes regression is not just a defense mechanism that we should condemn, that we should tell people don't do these silly things, but that regression sometimes can bring some wisdom or knowledge or strength or recuperation. So the ideas were there in the world of psychoanalysis about losing boundaries to the rest of the world, or simply I can remember this at this moment, whether he was a swimmer or not. And that was probably not as frequent these days as today. But had he ever been swimming in the Mediterranean, he would have felt it himself. Oceanic feeling has been described by many people, even in that time and before. Anthropologists, ethnologists, religious scholars, and so on and so on. The most famous, maybe the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony begins with the embrace of millions. So that's one form of it. So in Freud, we'll find various contradictions. This is not so everywhere. For instance, in his female psychology, he's deeply wrong, but he is consistent. He is wrong in the same way throughout. So one of the things we learn from Jones, from Freud's biography, which is like hagiographic one, that the artists are given up to the pleasure principle. So the difference between Freud, between scientists and artists live in the domain of pleasure principle, scientists live in the domain of reality principle. Why is this so, in Freud's opinion? Works of art come from fantasy, drives, wishes, unconscious material, and works of art give us the pleasure on the unconscious level. We like paintings, novels, plays, because we enjoy and we get some enjoyment out of them. The production and the consummation of arts are on the level of pleasure principle. With sciences, it's completely different. We have to try, to make a plan, to execute an experiment, to see the results, to compare with other people, to measure, and so on and so on. It's laborious and not very pleasurable. You write a scientific paper, no one cares. Roughly 1% of all the journals that ever arrive at the library of the University of Cambridge, anyone takes from the shelf. Roughly 1% of papers that have been taken from the shelf are read from the beginning to the end. So most of what we do in the world of science, no one cares about. There's once per century of Freud and Einstein and Nietzsche, someone. The rest, no one reads or cares about. Psychoanalysis then can master the world because psychoanalysis can explain art. Arts are very important because they work on the pleasure principle, but psychoanalysis is even more powerful, and with its very special reality principle, with its very special wisdom, psychoanalysis will explain arts. This is just one example of Freud's unlimited ambition. Freud believed he was capable of explaining more or less everything. History, sociology, politics, wars, sexuality, aggression, in a way, even cosmology, and then arts as well. Finally, Freud wrote very early, 1907, creative writers are valuable allies and their evidence is to be prized highly, for they are apt to know a whole host of things between heaven and earth of which our philosophy has not yet let us dream. Do you recognize the phrase? There is a part in it by the end which Hamlet uses when he talks to Horatio. There are things in heaven and earth that your philosophy doesn't dream of. So Freud quotes Shakespeare to tell us that creative writers can be valuable allies. So I think you can see over years that artists are enemies and friends, that they are a little silly because they are into the pleasure principle, and that we can use their insights. All sorts of contradictions are here. Freud, of course, has written enormously much, and contradictions are not that difficult to find. But it seems to me that here they are very striking. Finally, this is the letter from 1922 to the novelist and playwright Arthur Schnitzler. So Schnitzler and Freud both live in Vienna. And Schnitzler is one of the very few contemporaries Freud valued highly. They don't meet, they correspond. Vienna is not that large city even today. 100 years ago, it would not be any problem to meet. This confession, so the confession Freud is going to make, strikes me as too intimate. I think I have avoided you, personally, Schnitzler, from a kind of fear of my own double. Again and again, when I am absorbed in your splendid works, I seem to find beneath their fictional exterior the very same presuppositions, interests, and conclusions that I knew to be my own. Thus, I have formed the impression that you know through intuition, or rather through keen self-analysis, everything that I have discovered through a laborious work on other people. So now here we have idea. Here artists could have been valuable allies. 15 years later, Schnitzler is a double. Again, we have some sort of envy that artists do it very easily, and Freud had to suffer. But there is something probably more important. Decades later, American literary critic Harold Bloom will publish a book anxiety of influence. And he will try to trace and explain the phenomenon that we sometimes avoid quoting or mentioning or retaining friendships with people who influenced us most. Whatever we do, we pay careful attention never to mention the most important influence, never to quote, and so on and so on. So Bloom had a very specific idea when Freud's case came to the discussion. But here's one place that might corroborate that. Freud seems to have been aware that he was avoiding artists because he was afraid they knew it better and or they knew it before he did. I'll give you another example of this. When Freud and Otto Rank finally broke up, so to say, 1926, Rank was for years Freud's personal secretary. He contributed 2 chapters to the interpretation of dreams, to the later editions. So he was like Freud's right hand. He knew Freud's dreams better than anyone else. Then they disagree, and then they cannot reconcile, and then Rank decides to leave Vienna and leave the world of psychoanalysis. He brings Freud a present, and the present is complete works of Friedrich Nietzsche. The reason? Freud very systematically avoided reading Nietzsche or admitting that he had ever read him, and even said once, "I am afraid of reading this philosopher because I'm afraid I'll find the whole of my theory in his works." And when you are as ambitious as Freud was, then admitting that someone else was already there is horrible. So how does Freud interpret the arts? How does he understand what goes on in the world of arts? I told you he was very proud of his discoveries, but now let's try to see which ones these are. This is a book published in 1985, Art and Psyche, by Ellen Handler Spitz. She is an art historian, trained, I think, at Harvard and Fine Arts Museum in Boston. And then she graduated from the research track of the Columbia University's psychoanalytic training program. She's published many books on children's experience of arts, on imagination, on Magritte and some surrealist art, but this is her first book and a very basic one. It discusses the basic methodology of psychoanalytic approaches to the arts. And it says there are basically 3 psychoanalytic approaches to the world of arts. 1, psychobiography. Some authors would say pathobiography. So you're looking at a piece of art, and what you do is you're trying to connect the biography of the author with some elements of this piece of art. So when I play you some music or show you a painting, you don't discuss harmonies and counterpoint and things like that. You discuss the childhood and the parents and the mother and the father and so on and so on. Another approach is to try the interpretation of the piece of art just in vacuo, so to say, without the context. So I may take a novel or a play and then consider the characters in the novel as if they were my patients. Freud and most other psychoanalysts believe that literary characters sort of have the unconscious of their own. And so we discuss about things that are not in the play or that are not in the novel, but we believe might be important. So what was Hamlet's relationship with his father when he was a boy? That's nowhere in the play, but based on our psychoanalytic knowledge, we try to make predictions. We try to give explanations. Why did this character do or say this or did not? We try to figure out based on the unconscious of the character who we've never met, who's, as many literary critics have written, never been on Freud's couch. And finally, there is the approach that over the last couple of decades has been known as the reader response theory. Probably its most prominent American representative was Norman Holland. And he wrote about this approach, finding the transference that we usually look for in the psychoanalytic treatments, not between the artist and the artwork, but between the artwork and the recipient. So when I read a certain novel or when I listen to a certain composition, why is it that my experience is different from yours? Is it my unconscious in the dialogue with the work of art speaking in a different way than your unconscious in the dialogue with the same work of art speaking in another language or another tonality? This is not Freudian. This is later on. So a couple of examples. This is, when it comes to the world of psychoanalysis, definitely the most famous painting, the most frequently seen. Now, if you go to the website of the International Psychoanalytic Association or wherever, you will see Oedipus and Sphinx. She's giving him the riddle, he is thinking about the riddle, and he will solve it. Freud and his best friends, the so-called secret committee, they made rings, the secret rings, 7 of them, with this on the ring. So that meant they were very psychoanalytic. Why is this so important? Oedipus was believed for 2,500 years almost to be the best tragedy ever written. It's like that in Aristotle, in Hegel, in Nietzsche, everywhere. And everyone had an interpretation of this or that kind. But there was the basic question: are we crazy to enjoy tragedy? Why would we go voluntarily to the theater to watch something tragic and then feel there was something beautiful about it? And everyone wanted to try to figure out why. When it came to Freud, he was extremely proud of his solution. And he did not believe there were several solutions that were possible and then his would be applicable from time to time. He believed he found the solution. This is, we enjoy watching tragedy because we see on stage what we wanted to do ourselves. We see, Oedipus the Rex, or should I remind you of the plot? In Thebes, in ancient Greece, there's plague. People are dying, there's a horrible epidemics, and no one has an idea why. So they ask for the prophet, Tiresias, to tell them what is the reason for the plague. So this is ancient Greece. The play was written around 430 BC. So they believe health and illness are definitely connected to the gods. No idea of washing your hands or things like that. It is gods who are related to illness. So the prophet comes, he's blind as all prophets are, and he says, there is something very dirty. The place is soiled. It is not sacred anymore. And the reason for that there is a man in the city who has killed his father and married his mother. And of course, no one trusts him in the beginning because there is no such case anywhere in the city to be found. It turns out the ruler of the city, Oedipus, is the man who has done that. And he says that is impossible because my father and mother are in another city and I've left them many years ago and haven't seen them since. And then we discover that Oedipus was born in Thebes. The prophecy said he would kill his father and begot children with his mother. So his parents gave him to a man who would put him on the mountain, leave him there alone so that the baby would die. On top of that, they wounded his feet, although as a baby he wouldn't be able to walk. So Oedipus means the one who has two legs. So when Oedipus finally discovers that, and then quarrels with the prophet, not believing him, and then finally starts believing him, he asks the people of Thebes to send him, to punish him in the worst possible way, and that is to send him to the woods. Because the woods for the Greeks are chaos. They are outside of the world. They are outside of the logical order of the universe. But then he discovers his mother-wife, with whom he had 4 children, has gone to her rooms, taken, what is it that takes the clothes together? Pin, thank you. She took a pin and killed herself. And then he takes the same pin and plucks his eyes out. So that's the first Oedipus. There's another play written like 25 years later. Freud's belief was that he had discovered the basic principle of the functioning of human psyche in this play and related artworks. He remembered when he was 2 or 3 years old, he was traveling with his family by train. He woke up in the middle of the night and saw his mother naked. He believed this was somehow connected inside of him with his wish to marry his mother and his wish to kill his father. So he started believing that all of us, when we go to theater to watch the tragedy, we see on stage what is in our unconscious. We see on stage what we wanted to do. In a way, maybe envy Oedipus that he did it. In a way, we're happy that we will not be punished as he was. In the same letter, probably the most important letter he has ever written, Freud goes toward Hamlet and says there's the same plot in Hamlet. Hamlet's uncle has done what Hamlet wanted to do. Killed Hamlet's father and married Hamlet's mother. And now Hamlet envies him but cannot kill him because this one is so powerful that he managed to fulfill the wish Hamlet had. So this was 1987. Less than 10 years later, there will be a term, Oedipus complex. Oedipus complex will be believed by Freud and his early collaborators to be universal, present in everyone, in all historical periods, in all cultures, anywhere in the world. Now, we don't have time to go into this controversy, but just when it comes to the interpretation of arts, here starts the passion for discovering the Oedipus motive in artists and in artworks. So, as I told you, Otto Rank was one of Freud's closest collaborators. Freud paid for Rank to be able to become a university student. And then Rank graduated with a PhD on the incest motive in legends and sagas. that was the first PhD in the field of psychoanalysis, and it was about the Oedipus and incest and things like that. When early psychoanalysts wrote papers about arts, they were mostly about this. Hamlet and his Oedipus complex, then the idea of negative Oedipus complex was introduced, and so on. And very soon, you would see that the Oedipus motive was more frequent in arts than before. I truly believe that. So, here again, a couple of examples. 1907, and Freud publishes the first full paper that is devoted to the arts. That's his analysis of a very unknown novel on Gradiva. So this is the Roman sculpture that inspired the author, and nowadays is important in the world of psychoanalysis because the American Psychoanalytic gives Gradiva Award each January to authors of most important books, papers, and so on. If you read it, you will find Freud applying psychoanalytic knowledge to the work of art. From the very beginning, he is not learning from it. He is trying to use the novel to illustrate how to cure delusions. The novel is the illustration, and Freud will explain you what it can illustrate. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention a minute ago. Probably the most important paper, if you're interested in this Oedipus dynamics and Freud's literary critique, is his paper on Dostoevsky. Written 1927, much later than the rest. It is focused on the explanation, psychoanalytic explanation of the Dostoevsky's last novel, Brothers Karamazov. So one of the points of the novel is that the father is murdered. There are 4 sons, and for some time we are not sure which of the sons has killed the father. Freud introduced several very unusual ideas in this paper, that Dostoevsky was not epileptic but hysteric and so on. But it is a relevant paper if you're interested into this. This is one of the most important blunders. This is one very stupid mistake that Freud has made. He published a paper on Leonardo da Vinci and his childhood memories that was based on a novel a Russian author had written in German. In this novel, this was a biographical novel about Leonardo, and Freud learned some of the facts about Leonardo's childhood. So one of the things that was very important was that he was separated from his mother as a child. He was an illegitimate child, his father. And Freud believed Leonardo had a fantasy of having 2 mothers, of not knowing exactly which one is his mother. His father's legitimate mother or his biological mother. So he wrote that Leonardo is a small boy, that Leonardo has the memory of himself being an infant in a crib, which, if real, must have been a fantasy. Most probably was not possible to be memory. And then a vulture would come to the crib, touch his mouth with his tail, and then touch him several times with the tail on the lips. Freud believed this was something about the separation from the mother, and the vulture touching his lips must be connected to the memories of the breastfeeding. And then the vulture was a symbol of something very bad, deadly, mother without milk, and so on and so on. So then Freud focused on this painting. Do you see anything very psychoanalytic about the painting? Probably that's why none of us will be Freud one day. I personally see the usual beauty of Leonardo's paintings that to my mind are unique in their subtlety and so on. But Freud saw the vulture. And the vulture is here. Because of course when you go to museums, you turn the paintings upside down or 90% or something, and then you can see. To make matters worse, I mean, this is ridiculous enough. But to make matters worse, Freud read the book in which some parts of Leonardo's memories were translated from Italian to German, and wrongly. Leonardo never mentioned vulture, but crane, a very noble and elegant bird. So the interpretation Freud gave was completely wrong based on the wrong translation he read. Years ago, he wrote to Lou Salome that this was the most beautiful piece he had ever written. And when people pointed his attention to the bad translation, he wouldn't discuss it. That's how much he loved the paper. Another point about arts is the mysterious mechanism of sublimation. So all the defense mechanisms, Freud started with repression and then described many others, and then in the future of psychoanalysis, many other forms were introduced. They had a very basic purpose. Get rid of anxiety, return to the basic level of functioning, and allow me to focus on other things. If I wish something too much, if I'm afraid of something too much, I should either find another object, forget about what's forbidden or what causes anxiety, and so on and so on. Should I go into details about defense mechanisms? That probably is widely known. Yes?
Is defense the same thing as displacement, or is that a different mechanism?
Displacement is one form of defense mechanisms. That's one of the defense mechanisms. Displacement, rationalization, reaction formation, idealization, and so on and so on. All of these spend my energy. I need to invest into work to keep something out of my conscious awareness, to keep something in the unconscious, or to move, like in the case of displacement, from one object to the other. So basically, defense mechanisms are not symptoms or disorders, but if we use them too much or too rigidly, they may become signs that something very bad is going on. Sublimation is something completely different. Freud sees it as something very noble, as the name says it. You can see the idea comes from, in fact, the world of alchemy, that sublimation is the process where something solid does not have to become liquid and then gas, but can become gas immediately. I think the term itself introduced by Jung. Am I right? So sublimation is a defense mechanism that helps me produce something that will be socially acceptable and that other people will value highly. So in that way, sublimation is superior to all other defense mechanisms. One example that turned up later on in Freud's writing is that I'm a very aggressive boy, and then I become a surgeon. So my aggression is obvious in my cutting other people's bones, but I do it in a way that everyone will say, "Oh, thank you for being so good to humankind." For many human activities, psychoanalysts would tell you these are sublimated obsessive defenses, these are sublimated manic defenses, and so on and so on. But Freud believed that this is the mechanism that is in the basis of artistic creativity. We all have something inside of us that might be unacceptable to other people or too anxiety-provoking to ourselves, and so on. Yet some people are particularly good in using sublimation to transform these raw, unconscious material into something that other people would like. So in the Dostoevsky paper, he concludes the paper by saying that talent is something that psychoanalysis has to lay its arms before. He liked these military metaphors very often. So talent is something we cannot explain. We don't know why one person is better than the other in this capacity to sublimate. But Freud believed we can see that artists are using this pleasure principle material, unconscious material, somehow transform it into things that other people would like. So if I start screaming here about my wishes to kill someone or to rape someone or to steal something, no one's going to like it. If I can make it into a painting of a war between Greeks and Persians, you might come to the museum and look at it. If I can write an opera about a guy who has seduced more than 2,000 women, you might come to the opera to hear that music. So that was Freud's basic idea. There is no mystery whatsoever. So no muses, no metaphysical realms, nothing extraordinary. There is talent, we cannot explain it, but other than that, everything is usual. Drives, as everyone has, defense mechanisms, as everyone has, and some people better in sublimation than other people. Yes?
So does that mean that Freud is a materialist
Yes.
with the big M?
Yes. Freud hoped, as I said, that one day people will be equipped enough to explain everything neurologically. And all those invisible worlds, religion, and so on, he was completely closed for that. I would like to show you a couple of things about the reception of Freud, because I think that's very interesting. In the early years, Freud, starting 1901, organized in his apartment meetings that took place Wednesday evenings. In the beginning, there were 4 of them, and then later on, more and more people would join. And very early, there were several artists there, or one music critic, especially. And then, as Freud became popular and famous, artists reacted to it very strongly. One basic sign that Freud became famous is that there was an artistic movement that was a simple application of psychoanalysis to art production. Around the year 1900, some of Freud's early collaborators were involved in the so-called automatic writing. You take a pen, and then the pen writes whatever it wants, without your conscious control, if that's possible. So the very famous artistic movement started as automatic drawing or automatic writing of poetry, based on the idea of unconscious, free associations, and so on and so on. Absolutely explicit. Now, this is not what you will find in books about psychoanalysis. I'm afraid Freud did a very bad thing for arts, because there was one period when arts were liberated and did not have to follow the rules of religion or kings or anyone. And then in the 20th century, if you ask me, the arts too frequently just illustrate philosophy. So you look at a painting which says that Foucault believed that Althusser's mother and Lacan's daughter, blah, blah. that art illustrates instead of being very spontaneously produced. And that, I think, started with Freud. Freud introduced the notion that artists wanted to illustrate. Is this clear enough what I meant to say? Illustrate. Was this clear what I meant to say? The liberator of arts, you know who that was? Beethoven. Beethoven was the first person who wouldn't give them what they wanted. They would give him money and he would give them what he wanted. Listen to, for instance, Kreutzer Sonata. He made it especially difficult, full of staccato and extremely fast tempos, so that Kreutzer would not be able to play it, although Kreutzer gave the money for it. When Goethe and Beethoven were walking in Weimar, the king or the prince or someone was walking around, and Goethe bowed, and Beethoven continued walking, and they had to split so that he could pass. And later on he told Goethe, you shouldn't have bowed. There are countless princes in the world, or kings. There is just one Beethoven. So he created in his own way. All of the music, especially when he was deaf, is unprecedented. A piano concerto which starts with the piano. All Mozart concerti start with the orchestra, and then the piano comes later on. The symphony with the choir. Symphonies too long, too short, whatever he wanted them to be. So he was the first artist who was larger than the art, than Napoleon, than German kings, than everyone. And when you look throughout the 19th century, there is a period between 1925 and 1960. What happens in music at that time? There's just the shadow of Beethoven. And you don't see that Schubert lived there, that Mendelssohn lived there, and so on. It takes time for us to sober up from the power of Beethoven to see that there were other guys then. That's how influential he was. Wagner is the reaction to Beethoven, Chopin is the reaction to Beethoven, Mahler is the reaction to Beethoven, and so on. And the period of freedom might have ended with Freud. Freud introduced very strong philosophical conceptions, and they started illustrating it. And then postmodernism and Warhol and so on and so on. This is a letter written in 1936 when Freud celebrated his 80th birthday. So about Freud, whose discoveries have opened up the way to a new and profounder understanding of mankind. He has made eminent contributions to medicine, psychology, philosophy, and art, and has been for 2 generations the pioneer in exploring the hitherto unknown regions of the mind, and so on and so on. In every field of knowledge, in literature, art, research, history of religion, prehistory, mythology, folklore, pedagogy, and last but not least in poetry, we can trace his influence. Finally, we cannot picture the intellectual world today without his work, and we rejoice in his presence among us and his unabated activity. May our gratitude accompany his days. Published somewhere, I think London Times, and signed by Thomas Mann, Romain Rolland, Gilles Romain, H.G. Wells, Virginia Woolf, and Stefan Zweig. It is not very easy to find a stronger company. I mean, you could add someone somewhere, but to have these names under this letter is a huge, huge compliment. There were some people who were anxious about psychoanalysis destroying creativity. So I'll tell you in details in a couple of weeks. Rilke believed, when first suggested that he needed psychoanalytic help, he believed his life would be like a notebook of a pupil corrected by teacher's red ink, and he wanted to get as far away from that as possible. On the other side of the ocean, Eugene O'Neill, the creator of American theater, was analyzed for several months because of his excessive alcoholism and other problems. And he was afraid if suffering would disappear, creativity would disappear. If he were not suffering, there would be no reason to write plays. And finally, the funniest one to my mind, Vladimir Nabokov wrote that psychoanalysis was a form of totalitarianism based on his experiences with Soviet Union. He believed the totalitarian attitude of psychoanalysis was in reducing all phenomena on several symbols, reducing dreams to symbols. So Nabokov was the guy who came up with the idea the difference between the therapist and the rapist is merely in punctuation. He claimed there were several overrated authors in the history of Western literature, and among them were Mann, Rilke, and Dostoevsky. So the guy had a hell of a nerve. This is limited to the reactions on Freud. There are many other approaches and then many other imitations, illustrations, or critiques. There's just a reminder for the end. There is more or less nothing to be said about Freud's relationship to his contemporaries. There was, for instance, in 1902, a big secession exhibition, 75 years of Beethoven's death. Klimt and all the guys who were important at that time, Gustav Mahler and so on. Freud doesn't care. That was a huge Munch exhibition that was like an earth-shattering event in Vienna at that time. Freud doesn't care. We don't know that Freud went to the theater to watch his beloved Shakespeare. And he definitely never went to concerts. His wife was forbidden from going to the opera, and he went there just 5 times. The operas he watched are the ones with a very strong plot, like Carmen or Don Giovanni, but not those where music is very important. He writes about tiniest details from his travels. He never says, I went to the opera and they were singing bad, well, whatever. So this is completely missing from Freud's world and from Freud's attitude to the arts. I'm very sorry that you were so silent. This is the reminder for the rest. So next week, Freud's favorites in a bit more detail than today, and then 2 case studies later on. And I'm open to your questions.